Reconstruction Part 2: The New South. After the Civil War, Southerners promoted a vision for a self-sufficient Southern economy built on modern capitalist values, industrial growth, and improved transportation. So when we talk of the South, the New South is typically post-Civil War. So we have a philosophy, the Southern philosophy in a post-Civil War world. You have these redeemers, largely former slave owners, and they're going to be the bitterest opponents of the Republican program in the South. They staged a major counter-revolution to redeem the South by taking back Southern state governments. Their foundation rested on the idea of racism and white supremacy. Redeemer governments would wage an aggressive assault on African Americans and their rights. Southern Democrats will be the political leadership basically built out of these redeemers, and these would be the people who held office in the South. These Southern Democrats would, and they supported slavery, the use of intimidation, manipulation to return the South to a segregation and discrimination era after the Civil War. So the lost cause of the Confederacy. This is a belief developed among white Southerners in post-Civil War world. It's a period that claims the Civil War was a war over states' rights and national independence, and not defending and preserving the institution of slavery. So the KKK. It was founded in 1866 in the town of Pulaski, Tennessee. 6 former Confederate officers, including Nathaniel Bedford Forrest, who was a Confederate cavalry general, organized this club. This is right here, Nathaniel Bedford Forrest. As you see, they organized as a social club or a fraternity. They spent their time with horseplay, horse tricks, various types, including wearing disguises and galloping around towns after dark. They were surprised to learn, supposed to say learn, not earn. They were surprised to learn that their nightly appearances were causing fear, particularly among former slaves in the area. By 1868, Forrest would leave the KKK and he would actively work to destroy it. By 1870, the KKK had spread to almost every southern state. It was a vehicle for white Southern resistance to the Republican Party's Reconstruction era policies aimed at establishing political and economic equality for blacks. They waged a campaign of intimidation and violence directed at white and black Republicans. Its primary goal was to reestablish the reestablishment of white supremacy fulfilled through Democratic victories in the state legislatures across the South. By 1884, the KKK ceased to exist, though. It went out of existence. There's no chapters in any of these states. So we had talked about the Redeemers and we had talked about Southern Democrats, and the KKK is a vehicle that they would use to reestablish control in the South. So President Grant, the Grant era, started in 1869, lasted to 1877. He won 2 terms as president. So remember, Grant was one of the biggest success stories of the Civil War. He started out as a hotel clerk in Galena, Illinois. He reinstates himself in the military, or gets himself reinstated, and he's actually demoted one time during the Civil War before his rise to take over the Union Army, the Army of the Potomac, and lead all the war efforts from 1864 on. He will become Secretary of State under the Johnson administration, which will lead him into the presidency. He runs for president in 1868. He is a civil rights and Reconstruction president. He does believe in equal rights and the 14th Amendment and all that good stuff. So the election of 1868, Grant won, and he received over 500,000 votes from black Americans. First time in U.S. history African Americans allowed to vote in an election, and they came out. 500,000 of them voted. Seeing the importance of the black vote, radical Republicans drafted the 15th Amendment protecting voting rights for minorities, minority men. So you got to think, this also includes all ethnic groups, all minorities, not just African Americans, but yes, No one could be barred from voting because of race, color, or slavery. This amendment was ratified in 1870. Grant passes 3 enforcement acts to end the KKK. He makes it a federal crime to interfere with citizens' rights to vote. He put federal marshals in supervision of federal elections, and the Ku Klux Klan Act would outlaw activities of the Klan. However, the Republicans would split, and in 1872 you have the Liberal Republicans formed by or led by Horace Greeley, and his famous little slogan was "Turn the rascals out." However, Grant would win re-election. Oh. So corruption under the Grant administration, he is not a legislative first president like Lincoln was. He basically said it was Congress's job to pass the laws and his job to enforce them. So he was not a legislative leader in the fact that like Lincoln was. And this is going to kind of return the presidency to the way it was pre-Civil War. It will change under Teddy Roosevelt and will become more of a 20th century office. But as you see here, Grant is plagued with a lot of corruption in his administration. He was a great general. He was a great man, but he entrusted people that were not so great. As you see, the Fisk and Gould, they try to corner the market they try to corner the gold market, and this is going to lead to Black Friday in 1873. The price of gold will drop, and basically, it causes the panic. It's one of the causes of the panic of 1873. The Tweed Ring in New York City, led by Boss Tweed, milked New York City for over $200 million. We'll talk about that a little bit later. The Credit Mobiler scandal, basically you see RP Construction Company was formed by Union Pacific Railroad. They were hired by Union Pacific Railroad to build the railroad line. And as you see here, they paid themselves $50,000 per mile of construction, and it only cost $30,000. So they took that $20,000 and skimmed it off the top and kept it. The Whiskey Ring, as you see, government officials in St. Louis would rob the Treasury of millions of dollars in excise tax revenues. Secretary of War Belknap, he made $24,000 by selling the privilege of distributing supplies to Indians. The Panic of 1873, we see this huge economic crisis that develops under Grant, and some of these things, definitely the gold market here is one of the causes. So Grant enters office and fills the president's role as to carry out the laws, and he left the development of policies to Congress. As I said earlier, this is a departure from Lincoln, and it's going to kind of return the presidency back to being the second strongest branch in government, and Congress will continue its domination over government through this century. It will be changed. It changes under Theodore Roosevelt, but for right now, that Grant's philosophy weakens the presidency. Grant's position on the presidency, he left the Republican Party split and undermined the public support for Reconstruction. Congress kept tariffs high, tightened banking regulations, and increased federal spending on railroads and port facilities. Republican Party placed sin taxes on citizens. This is taxes on alcohol and tobacco. This was also known as the era of good stealings, waste, extravagance, speculation, and graft. It's going to become later known, as we talk about this, as the Gilded Age. It ushers in the era of the Gilded Age. So, political differences in the South. We have carpetbaggers. These are Northerners who moved to the South. Quite a few were elected or appointed to government positions in state governments. Southerners called them carpetbaggers because they arrived with their suitcases made of carpet fabric. So what is a scalawag? A scalawag is a Southerner who disliked other Southerners who worked for Republicans and supported Reconstruction. So a scalawag was a Southerner who worked for Reconstruction or worked for Republican goals. So they were reform oriented, and they were called scalawags. And by the way, carpetbaggers and scalawags were the target of violence and death. So it was dangerous for them in the South. This is a cartoon, political cartoon of a carpetbagger. If you look, the military has propped him up in power. And who's doing all the hard work? Basically Southerners. Freedmen's Bureau. In the last months of the war, it's established in the last months of the war to serve both poor whites and blacks, distributing clothes, food, hospitals, and schools where they were needed. Many Union troops had to deal with freed African Americans flocking to the Union lines as the war progressed. So these freed men, equal basically freed African Americans, began to follow armies. One in particular, they followed Sherman's troops, and they were seeking food and shelter. But Sherman had to move. Basically, this was from his march from Atlanta to Savannah up through North Carolina, and he had to move his army quickly, so he couldn't deal with this. So he decides to settle 40,000 acres, or excuse me, he decides to settle all 40,000 African Americans on 500,000 acres of land in South Carolina and the Georgia coast, down towards Savannah and Beaufort County. Basically, this refugee crisis prompted Congress to establish the Bureau of Refugees and Freedmen, and basically they took over abandoned lands, and this became known as the Freedmen's Bureau. So, given the task of feeding and clothing the war refugees in the South using Army surplus supplies, some want to offer more and argued enslaved peoples argued that former enslaved people should be given 40 acres and a mule to support themselves. This is a statement that William Sherman makes. He says, I'm going to give you 40 acres and a mule. A lot of people support that. So the Freedmen's Bureau made a lasting contribution to education. You need to know that. Basically, you're going to start seeing public education come about out of this. So the Freedmen's Bureau also believed that the federal government should seize Confederate land and distribute this land to emancipated African Americans, to give them land, to give them a social standing. Did Congress support the seizing of Confederate land and giving it to former slaves? The answer is going to be no, Congress will not, because they felt that it violated the nation's commitment to individual property rights. That would be your Fifth Amendment. So the end of Reconstruction comes. A couple of things help end it. In 1872, the Amnesty Act granted Southern political elite citizenship. This set up the election of 1876, where now you see these redeemers and these Southern Democrats. They start winning elections in 1874, 1872, 1874, and then that sets up the election of 1876. 1876 is going to be crucial because it's going to end congressional reconstruction of the South. People had grown weary of it. It long, cumbersome, all that kind of good stuff, spending a lot of money on it. So the election of 1876, you see Rutherford B. Hayes, who won the popular vote, but he didn't win the Electoral College. So how did he become president? The House voted him in on 3 conditions, and it's known as the Solid South Compromise. You need to know it. Number 1, federal troops would withdraw from South Carolina and Louisiana. The federal government would pay money to build a railroad from Texas to the West Coast to improve southern rivers, and President Hayes had to appoint 1 conservative Southerner to his cabinet. So he promised to this stuff, and so he became the next president. He also promised he was a reform president, and he also promised 1 term. He would only serve 1 term. So as you see, it's known as the Solid South Compromise. It's also known as the Compromise of 1877. So we need to know those 2 terms. So we will pick up part 3 on this slide.